understanding your audience. This is one of the most critical parts of becoming an effective communicator. You have to understand the people who are going to get your communication. So one of the first things that I want you to think about are some of the differences between attitudes, beliefs, and values. One quick tip as we go through this and through, of course, all the other presentations for the class is to write down your own thoughts and then check them in the book. This is a really good way to study. So for example, if I were to ask you what is a self-concept, and of course I'm going to guess this is a new term for many of you, you might pause the video, write down what you think it is, and then proceed to the next slide. So self-concept is the idea of how we perceive ourselves. Public communication starts with intrapersonal, so INTRA, personal communication. You need to know what you want to say before you can say it to an audience. Awareness determines what you're going to pay attention to. So what the self-concept is going to add to this is that we have a set of perceptions about who we think we are, our own identity. So in the book, self-concept is a combination of self-image, how you see yourself and describe yourself to others, and self-esteem, how you feel about yourself. And of course, self-concepts are going to be partly subjective. So for example, we'll have objective aspects like your height, your hair color, your age, or your occupation. Those are things that are going to generally be fact, but we'll have subjective. So if we think of objective, like let's say I am a 5'8", I am a tall person. Well, tall is subjective, but 5'8" is objective. Subjective is going to be based on opinions or evaluations. It could even be things like your honesty, your sense of humor, your intelligence, and your talent. The second part of this is that how we perceive ourselves plays into this idea of the looking glass self. That means you're evaluating yourself based on how you think others see you, treat you, and interact with you. When we do this, we tend to put particular emphasis on people who have some degree of control over us when we look at ourselves. So parents, the supervisors, a professor. You're probably going to believe somebody who has some kind of authority more than you would just some random person who walked up to you. We also have the concept of self-fulfilling prophecies. If you've ever heard about the growth mindset, there's some similarities here. Self-fulfilling prophecies can reinforce our self-concept. We have these expectations based on how we perceive ourselves and others. We communicate those expectations with cues that are verbal and nonverbal. Our expectations prompt us to act in specific ways, and then people respond to those cues by adjusting their behavior to match expectations. Those actions bring about outcomes we expected and reinforce our self-concepts. So for example, if you think about a test that you're taking and you go in thinking, I'm going to be successful, I'm going to be awesome, versus you go in thinking, I am so dumb, I cannot do anything, then generally you'll do a little better if you think that you're going to be successful. The danger there that you may have seen or maybe even experienced is the idea that you go in thinking, I am awesome at business communication, I don't need to study this at all. And then you show up to, let's say, a class that has a test and realize, yikes, in fact, it was really hard to remember the exact definition or the 8 components of communication. Self-fulfilling prophecies can reinforce our self-concept. We'll have expectations based on how we perceive others. We're going to communicate those expectations with cues and, like I said, change our actions and get the outcomes that we want. So what does this have to do with work? How is it going to influence what happens in the workplace? How can these play a role in stereotyping? Let's use the example of a group presentation. So you meet this group of strangers and we'll just go with a guy. One guy says, I am an awesome presenter. I love doing this. I get really great feedback from all my teammates. Let's pause and think, you're sitting in that group. Do you believe them? Positive self-fulfilling prophecy maybe, but it could be that their self-concept is not based on facts. It's based on the fact that, I don't know, their buddies told them they were really awesome. So you need to be careful here in the workplace. On the flip of that, I've seen a lot of people who go in saying, oh, I'm not going to be good at presenting. This is something that's not really hard. And it turns out they're amazing presenters. And so at work, we do the same thing. You think, oh, I'm not good at meetings. I don't want to do that keynote. But then it turns out that you were the one who should have done it. You knew it best. So we need to be really careful there to know what these are based on, because expectations are going to influence outcomes. There was an experiment done years ago, but it's been repeated, where they gave everybody in a class the same test. And we told teachers that some of them were children who were clever. They weren't. And some of them, the children were not clever. They were the same kids. So they tested the class at the end of the school year, and the children who the teachers believed were clever improved more than other children. Let's take that back to the classroom presentation. You go up to your professor and you say, oh man, I'm so bad at presentations. I just don't do well. I'm using lots of trailing words like I'm doing right now on purpose. And then they're going to believe you. So don't do that. Especially you end a presentation, be positive and don't put yourself down there. We need to be really careful about the way we set things up. This connects to the idea of perception. So this is that active process of making meaning from experience. We select, organize, and interpret actions, people, events, all based on a couple different things. So from experience, subjectively and quickly, we're going to select, organize, and interpret. What we tend to notice are things that are unusual or unexpected, or things that are repetitive or really intense. So when you think about ads, let's use commercials during the Super Bowl. Which ones do you actually remember? Is it the ones that, I don't know, you saw it before, or it's the same type of thing? Or is it something that's going to be really bold, something that's not quite the same? Maybe it repeats one factor. Think about Budweiser does a really good example of this when they repeat the frogs or they repeat their Clydesdales. It's something that they built into their brand. We can kind of expect it, but not really when you start making it do different things or be representative of something new. What about other factors that influence perception? So that can have to do with your senses. It can do with selection too. So with selective exposure, we're choosing what we pay attention to. We're choosing what we pay attention to, what we focus on, and what we choose to remember. So those are the three main parts of selection that are straight out of your textbook. For organization, then we're going to start to use these schemas as mental structures and use them to group together related information or take in new information. So these can be physical. We're thinking about things that emphasize people's appearance. It can be having to do with a role or interaction, or even something that's going to be psychological. So with interpretation, you're going to use personal experience, your knowledge of something, and the closeness of your relationship. This will have to do with how we perceive others. Schemas influence what we pay attention to. We learn information quickly if it fits into our schema, but we tend to be cognitive misers. So once we start to have things that are outside of what our normal schema is, sometimes people will just straight out reject it because it doesn't fit with what they think should be. So let's say, maybe if some of you have a younger sibling or kids, you've maybe seen this, a younger child has met a horse and then they see a cow. And she says, oh, look, it's a horse. But why? It's because her schema for a horse is that it's going to have 4 legs and hair. It's a mammal. It might have some shoes and legs. I don't think you'd put a saddle on a cow, but I guess you could. It's going to be large. It's going to look somewhat similar. It's got 2 ears and eats grass. But cows and horses, of course, different, and then they'll start to modify their schema when they realize, oh yeah, you really can't put a saddle onto that cow and ride it around like you could a horse. So the child's going to have a new schema for a cow. They moo, they might make milk. Some might just eat or be eaten, and there's going to be different layers to that as the more you learn about a cow. As they grow, they're going to start to have a new horse schema. So they might think rodeo or mane or ride or ranch or saddle. It can be a fun pet or something that you see at a holiday, or later on something that's mistreated versus something that's produced for food. Here's another way to look at that with the different types of schemas. Here you can kind of see how they're cognitive frameworks or concepts that are helping us organize and interpret information. They're useful because we can take shortcuts in interpreting the vast amount of information that's available in our environment. However, these mental frameworks can also cause us to exclude pertinent information to focus instead only on things that confirm our pre-existing beliefs and ideas. Schemas can contribute to stereotypes and make it difficult to retain new information that doesn't confirm with our established ideas about the world. One example, and it's a little bit controversial, is you think about women in the workplace. If you're going into a place that has, let's say, a law firm that's only had male partners and it's always had female administrative assistants or secretaries, that's a huge schema, a cognitive framework that people have used to organize information that they have to be really conscious of overcoming because it doesn't fit with their ideas of the pre-existing world. It's going to be a big change, and of course that change is hard. So in summary on this, our schemas are going to be part of our cognitive framework. Our interpretation is helping us take shortcuts, and we tend to focus on different things. The problem here is that this can contribute to stereotypes or even make it difficult to retain new and contradictory information. The next step with this is I want you to think about the 3 stages of perception and know that these aren't linear. That's going to be selection, organization, and interpretation. How we perceive others is really interesting. So perception has several influences. We have cultures, we have co-cultures, we have border cultures, stereotypes, and we know this idea of the primacy and recency effects, which I'll explain in a second, and then this idea of perceptual sets. So let's talk about these. Stereotypes, somewhat obviously, are going to be these exaggerated or distorted generalizations about a whole category of people. And it's not going to acknowledge individual variation. It's just going to be assumed if you are this, you are going to be that. And of course, that absolutely leads to really detrimental prejudice and discrimination. In the workplace, this is important because good people don't get the good promotions they need. We can end up missing out on the right candidate for the job if people are discriminating based on what they see in a resume, and there is research that says that happens. The next thing that's really interesting here is the idea of the primacy effect and the recency effect. This is a really key thing from this class. So that means we remember what we hear in the beginning and we remember what we hear in the end, but the stuff that's in the middle starts to get a little bit muddled. It is what we are least likely to remember. And that can be a problem. You think about a long class, let's say you have a 3-hour night class, that means, from 8 p.m. to 8:45, that's the information that's going to start to get lost. But there's a good thing here too. That's the idea, is that in a speech or a paper, and you already know this with papers, you put that main idea at the beginning and at the end. Think about this in a class presentation. You have the really great content at the beginning and at the end. There's a good chance they're not always going to remember everything in the middle. There's going to be that strongest first impression, and then the recall is going to come at the end. When it comes in, at the end, they're going to remember it, which means you need to be really careful there at the end on that recency effect, that people leave with whatever your main idea is. Like, what do you want them to remember? Takeaway, just to be really clear here, items presented first and last are remembered better than those that are in the middle. So knowing this, how do you structure messages to be more effective? Strong first impression, go big at the beginning, be really clear, and then at the end, remember that's going to be their takeaway. Don't trail off at the end and just let it walk out. I've had student presentations in JSOM where they got to the last slide, they hadn't really written a conclusion, so they flash the end slide and walk out the door. Hopefully you've never done that, but I've seen it over and over. So the last impression is, what was that? That's not what you want. Take those concluding moments, make them super powerful. So again, with the recency effect, just be sure you know this definition. The most recent impression we have of a person's communication is going to be more powerful than earlier impressions. This can be problematic. Think about using social media. Let's say you've had a fantastic week at work, you've hit all your targets, you had a great presentation because you applied that primacy and recency, order, knowledge, And then you go out to happy hour or you go out to a meal and you post, look at this lady here, a picture of yourself making a ridiculous face. So that means if your boss had seen that, they're going into the weekend not thinking about everything awesome that you did. They're thinking about whatever they've seen most recently. So you really want to be careful there. The idea of a perceptual set is the idea that people have a predisposition to perceive only what they want or expect to see. So I love that picture there. When you start to think you're looking at sheep, and of course there's a sheepdog there. An equally valid motto there might be, I'll see it when I believe it. I'll repeat that. I'll see it when I believe it. Our perceptual set influences how we make sense of people and circumstances and events. It relates back to stereotypes. Why is that so important in business communication? Well, the importance is going to be our final thoughts. So you're going to notice right there I did a couple of things. I'm signposting them, which we'll talk about in a future chapter. I'm pointing out this is the conclusion. I'm also putting this main idea at the end so I can take advantage of the recency effect. So to go back to my last question, why is perception so important? It's because of self-perception influences our performance. Our perception of others influences how we treat people, even the words that we choose. It impacts our communication. And it connects back to the idea that knowing our audience is really important, but knowing our blinders is also incredibly critical to being an effective communicator. So the main ideas that we went through in this chapter are the differences between attitudes, beliefs, and values. We talked about self-concept, the looking glass self, and the self-fulfilling prophecy. We talked about the 3 states of perceptions and the idea of culture, stereotypes, primacy, and recency, and perceptual sets are all things that are layered onto the idea of what we're doing. So when you walk into a room and you start that presentation, there's all this baggage that you are bringing with you. You need to know your audience. You need to know yourself. And if you're able to, in this class, improve those 2 things, I think you're going to be really on your way to improving your business communication overall.